Well, hello, it's the 29th of July. This is Renew Every Morning, and I'm Paul Anderson-Walsh. As always, delighted that you're with me, so thank you. Well, today we have a very, very interesting postcard. It's a postcard actually not just from one person, but essentially from five. And this is about Zelophehad's daughters. I wonder if you remember the story from Numbers 27. And these, I'm going to call these the ones who asked for more. And in Numbers 27 and verse 1 through 4, there's a very interesting discussion. And it simply says this. So the key verse we're going to take is this. Then drew near the daughters of Zelophehad. Why should the name of our father be taken away from this clan because he had no son? Give us property among our father's relatives. Well, now this is a really interesting conversation. If you're interested in gender diversity and gender equity, this is a passage for you. Now, these five daughters all have names worth remembering, by the way. You have to dig them out a little bit, but here they are. The first one, and I think what's interesting about these names is names to me always carry some sort of prophetic intention. So I think whenever I see names, I always want to think about what do they mean. So the first of the daughters is called Mahlah, or Mahlah, M-A-H-L-A, and her name actually means sickness or affliction. It comes from chala, the idea of being weak or perhaps being wounded, and possibly there's some sort of relationship to her name, given that name because of potentially something that happened to her birth, yet she becomes a very interesting healing force in her society. So I want you to watch that. I say that because in Psalm 103 verse 3, he heals our diseases, and that word there is derived from this same word Mahlah. So I think that's quite interesting. Then we have the daughter Noah, indeed, the same name as Noah that you're thinking about from the son of Lamech in Genesis 6. And this name means movement or kind of motion, I suppose. And here, this isn't to be confused with Noah from the ark, but the idea here is it means also rest and comfort. So what happens is that this Noah represents a kind of divine shift, if you like, in terms of moving what in this case is actually an unjust system forward. So that's quite helpful. Then we have Hoglah, and her name means partridge. And in Scripture, this is a very interesting character, and you'll see it in Jeremiah 17. The partridge is described as vulnerable, yet alert and fiercely protective. So she stands for those who are kind of grounded and brave. She speaks, I think, to us about the legal warriors. And then you have Milcah, and her name means queen. And this is a name of sovereignty. And here, the idea is she enters the tent, not not as a subject. She wants to enter the tent as an equal. And so she's a very powerful character. And then you have Tirzah, the final daughter, and her name means delight and beauty and peace. And so later, interestingly, her name is used for the name of the royal city. She represents kind of beauty and rightful belonging. So each name in this story, each of the daughters' name, they carry a kind of spiritual archetype, if you want. They carry something prophetic with them. And taken together, they stitch together into something very profound. So what has happened? Well, the story really is about a legacy of fear that gets transformed by faith. So the name Zelophehad means shadow and fear. So this is about someone who lives in the shadow of fear. And he had died. He was the man who died in the wilderness, and he died in the wilderness without sons. And in this particular time, in this particular culture, inheritance was passed through the male lineage, and the risk, therefore, was his name and his legacy and his memory would vanish. Now, of course, here's the important point. Although his name meant shadow of fear, these young women are determined to outchase that shadow and outrun that shadow. Each of us have parental shadows, don't we, that are going to follow us throughout our lives. But these five girls were committed to the idea of outrunning it. And so they say, look, the daughters refuse to inherit that fear from their father. They're not prepared to do that. They stepped out of that shadow and they brought their case not just to Moses, but they brought their case before God. And the divine response was very, very significant. The daughters of Zelophehad are right, and the law had to be changed. Now, this is amazing because this isn't about justice. This is about, sorry, this isn't just about land. This is also about justice. This is what happens when faith moves and becomes a holy precedent. So if the talking point here is these desert daughters become essentially these boardroom advocates. And I can tell you in the work I do around inclusion and equity, this idea of advocacy and equity is a super interesting point. The amount of discussion we've had about women and gender equality in the boardroom, and how when women are on boards, their organizations are altogether more functional, more productive. Well, here is a really interesting example about how these women come and they confront this system and bring about change. Is brilliant. Now, this ancient story isn't just fossilized in the wilderness, as I'm saying. It echoes in the boardrooms of our day. It's just so interesting. Where laws excluded them, they asked for equity. Where culture just dismissed them, they claimed their dignity. And where fear threatened to define them, they were not prepared to be defined by that, but they moved by faith. Now, as I say, today it's such a nice example because gender equality still requires that kind of holy audacity. There are plenty of communities where this is still such a live issue. To speak up when you're silenced, to move when stillness is expected, to ask for more, not for more than others, but to be asked to be treated equally well. And that's the kind of key theme here, this notion of being treated equally well. And these daughters don't demand privilege, they claim belonging. And in so doing, they open the door for the generations that were following behind them. It's very, very powerful. And in fact, there is a legal sequel to this in Numbers 36. The law was extended. Their inheritance is protected on the condition they married within their tribe to preserve the tribal boundaries. But the heart of their boldness remained, and it's remembered to this very day as we're even talking about it. So the final thought here is very simple. This is not just a story about gender. It's about generational healing. It's about spiritual boldness. It's about asking God for more, not out of greed, but out of grace. And it's a lovely idea, I think. And it's sometimes, at the times, the deepest act of faith is to speak when, and not to let, if you like, the silence speak for you. So I hope you're encouraged in that, and that you'll be renewed. And I hope that you will pick up these 5 names and just see how together they come to help to have a renewed mind. All right, God bless. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.